Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Tonight, we have something truly special and terrifying in store. I'll be sharing 5 chilling horror stories sent in by our brave subscribers. These are real-life experiences that will send shivers down your spine and make you think twice about turning off the lights. So, settle in, grab a blanket, and prepare yourself for a night of eerie tales that you won't soon forget. Dear Mr. Phantom Knight, I never thought I'd be one of those people writing in with a story like this. I always considered myself a rational person, not easily swayed by superstition or the supernatural. But what I experienced changed everything. To this day, I still don't have a logical explanation for it, and I'm not sure if I ever will. It all started last fall when I moved into a new apartment. I was excited about the move, a fresh start in a new city, closer to my job, and in a neighborhood that had a good reputation. The building itself was old but well maintained, with a sort of charm that made me feel like I was stepping back in time. The landlord was an elderly woman named Mrs. Thompson, who seemed sweet enough. She showed me around the place, and everything seemed fine. But there was something about the apartment that felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. It was subtle, just a feeling of unease that crept over me whenever I was alone in the apartment. I brushed it off as nerves, the stress of moving and adjusting to a new environment. But that feeling of being watched never really went away. The first night I spent in the apartment was uneventful, but the second night was when things started to get strange. I had just turned off the lights and settled into bed when I heard a soft creaking sound coming from the hallway. At first I thought it was just the old wood floors settling, but the sound kept getting closer, like footsteps approaching my bedroom door. My heart started racing, and I froze, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. I lay there in the dark, holding my breath, waiting for something to happen. But after a few minutes of silence, I convinced myself it was nothing, just the building settling, or maybe my imagination running wild. I eventually drifted off to sleep, but that night marked the beginning of a series of unsettling events. Over the next few days, I started noticing small things out of place. A book that I knew I had left on the coffee table would be on the floor when I came home from work. A picture frame on the wall would be slightly tilted, even though I was sure it had been straight before I left. I tried to tell myself that I was just being forgetful, that I must have moved things without realizing it. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Then came the voices. It was late one night, around 2 a.m., when I woke up to the sound of whispering. It was faint, almost like a breeze rustling through leaves, but distinctly human. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was urgent, insistent. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, and listened. The whispering seemed to be coming from the walls themselves, surrounding me, closing in. I was too terrified to move, too afraid to even turn on the light. The whispering continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes before it suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, oppressive. I didn't sleep at all that night, and when morning finally came, I felt exhausted, drained, like something had been feeding off my fear. I started dreading coming home after work. The apartment, once a place of comfort, had become a source of anxiety. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, more intense. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in on me, suffocating me with an unseen presence. One evening, about a week after the whispering started, I decided to take a bath to try and relax. The bathroom was small, with an old clawfoot tub that added to the apartment's vintage charm. I filled the tub with hot water and tried to unwind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The air felt heavy, thick with tension. As I lay there staring up at the ceiling, I noticed something strange in the corner of my eye. The mirror above the sink started to fog up, which was odd because I hadn't turned on the hot water in the sink, only in the tub. I sat up, watching in disbelief as words began to form in the condensation on the mirror. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but the words became clearer, more defined. They weren't written by a finger. There were no smudges or streaks, just perfectly formed letters appearing out of nowhere. The words read, "Get out." I jumped out of the tub, my heart racing, and grabbed a towel. I wiped the mirror clean, hoping that the message would disappear, that it had been some weird condensation pattern. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. I stared at my reflection, pale and shaken, as fear gnawed at me. I was no longer alone in that apartment. The next day, I called Mrs. Thompson and told her what had been happening. I didn't mention the mirror specifically, but I asked if anyone had ever complained about strange occurrences in the apartment. She hesitated before answering, her voice slightly trembling. She admitted that the previous tenant had also experienced unusual things, but she didn't elaborate. She only said that the tenant had moved out suddenly, leaving most of their belongings behind. That was the last straw for me. I decided I needed to get out of there too. I started looking for a new place immediately, but it wasn't easy finding something affordable on short notice. Meanwhile, the activity in the apartment escalated. One night, as I was packing some of my things, the lights started flickering. At first, it was just a brief dimming. But then the bulbs began to strobe erratically, casting eerie shadows across the room. I stood there, frozen, as the temperature in the apartment plummeted. My breath came out in visible puffs, and the air felt thick with electricity. The lights flickered one last time before going out completely, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled for my phone, using its flashlight to navigate through the apartment. I was about to head for the door when I heard it, a loud crash from the kitchen. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to run, but something compelled me to see what had happened. When I reached the kitchen, I found all the cabinets wide open, their contents scattered across the floor. The table had been overturned, chairs knocked over, as if some unseen force had ransacked the room in a fit of rage. I backed away slowly, my pulse racing, when I heard the whispering again. This time it was louder, more frantic, like a chorus of voices all speaking at once. They were coming from the hallway, moving closer, surrounding me. I bolted for the door, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the lock. As I stepped out into the hallway, I felt a cold gust of air rush past me, slamming the door shut behind me with a force that rattled the walls. I didn't look back as I ran down the stairs and out into the street. I didn't stop running until I was several blocks away, breathless and trembling. I spent that night in a hotel, too afraid to go back to the apartment. The next day, I called in sick to work and went to the apartment only to grab my essentials. I left most of my things behind. I couldn't bring myself to stay there any longer than necessary. It took me a few weeks to find a new place, but I finally did. I never went back to that apartment, not even to retrieve my belongings. Mrs. Thompson understood and didn't charge me for breaking the lease early. She didn't ask any questions, and I didn't offer any explanations. Even now, in my new apartment, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, expecting to hear those footsteps or the whispering. I still feel like something is watching me, waiting for the right moment to make its presence known again. I've tried to move on, to put the whole experience behind me, but it haunts me, lingering in the back of my mind. I've come to realize that some places are simply wrong, tainted by whatever dark history they hold. There are things in this world that we can't explain, things that defy logic and reason. I don't know what was in that apartment, and I'm not sure I ever want to know. All I know is that I'm glad I got out when I did. Thank you for reading my story, Mr. Phantom Knight. I hope it serves as a warning to others. Sometimes, when something feels off, it's best to trust your instincts and leave before it's too late. Sincerely, William. Dear Mr. Phantom Knight, I've always been a skeptic when it comes to things that can't be explained by science. I'm a software developer, and my life revolves around logic and data, not ghost stories or supernatural phenomena. But what happened to me in my old apartment in Toronto defies all logic and reason. I'm still not sure how to process it, and I hope that sharing my story can help me make sense of it. A few months ago, I moved into a new apartment in a historic building in downtown Toronto. The place had character, exposed brick walls, high ceilings, and large windows that offered a great view of the city. I was excited about the move and thrilled with my new home. Everything was perfect, or so I thought. The trouble started on my second night in the apartment. I had just finished unpacking and was getting ready for bed when I heard a strange noise coming from the hallway. It was a soft, rhythmic thumping, like someone tapping lightly on a door. I figured it was just the building settling, or maybe a neighbor moving around. But the thumping continued, and it grew louder. It wasn't consistent though. It was almost as if someone was trying to get my attention. I went to check the hallway, but there was no one there. I tried to brush it off and went to bed, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the old wooden floorboards seemed amplified in the silence of the night. The next night, I was woken up by the sound of my doorbell ringing. It was 3 a.m. I got up to check who it was, but when I looked through the peephole, there was no one there. I opened the door to find the hallway empty and quiet. I figured it was a prank or maybe a malfunctioning doorbell, but the feeling of unease persisted. The following week, things took a turn for the worse. I started noticing that my belongings were being moved around. My keys would be in different places than where I left them, and books would be out of order on my shelves. I was convinced I was just disorganized or maybe sleep deprived, but the changes kept happening even when I made a conscious effort to keep everything in place. One evening, as I was working late, I heard a loud bang coming from the kitchen. It was as if something heavy had fallen. I went to investigate, but there was nothing out of place. I checked all the cupboards and the appliances, but everything seemed normal. As I turned to leave, I noticed the temperature had dropped significantly. I could see my breath in the air, and I shivered despite being dressed warmly. I dismissed it as a draft and went back to my work, but the eerie feeling lingered. The following night, things got even stranger. I was in bed trying to fall asleep when I heard the distinct sound of someone whispering. It wasn't clear, and I couldn't make out any words, but it was close, almost as if someone was standing right next to my bed, speaking softly. I turned on the light and looked around, but again, there was no one there. The whispering was followed by a faint scratching sound, like nails on a chalkboard, coming from the walls. I started avoiding the apartment as much as possible, spending long hours at work and staying out with friends. But eventually I had to go back. I couldn't stay away forever. When I did return, the sense of dread was almost palpable. I felt like I was walking into a pressure chamber of anxiety every time I crossed the threshold. One night, as I was attempting to get some sleep, I was abruptly jolted awake by a violent shaking of my bed. It felt as if someone, or something, was trying to pull me out of bed. I grabbed the flashlight I kept by my bedside and shone it around the room, but there was nothing visible. My heart was racing as I checked under the bed and in the closet. Nothing was out of place. I sat up, trying to calm my racing thoughts, but the sensation of being pulled persisted. The shadowy figure appeared that same night. It started with a feeling of pressure on my chest, like something was sitting on me, making it hard to breathe. When I managed to sit up, I saw the dark silhouette looming over me. It was a shape without features, a void that seemed to absorb all light around it. The shadow was larger than any human could be, its edges shifting and writhing as if it were alive. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My phone was on the bedside table, but it felt like it was miles away. I reached for it, struggling against the invisible weight on my chest. When I finally turned on the flashlight, the shadow dissipated instantly, leaving me alone in the dark room, panting and sweating. That was the last straw. I didn't stay another night in the apartment. I packed up my essentials and stayed at a friend's place until I could find a new place to live. The friend, who lived in a more modern building, was understanding but concerned. They tried to reassure me that it was just stress and that I should try to relax. I appreciated their support, but I knew what I had experienced was beyond mere stress. I contacted the building management and told them about the strange occurrences, but they were dismissive, saying it was probably just the quirks of an old building. They assured me that nothing unusual had ever been reported before. I asked if there were any previous tenants who had experienced similar issues, but they wouldn't provide any information. While waiting for my new apartment to become available, I started researching the building's history. I found out that it had been built in the early 1900s and had been home to many tenants over the decades. One article mentioned that during the 1960s, a tenant had reported similar disturbances, but there was no follow-up. It seemed like the building had a history of unexplained events, but nothing concrete to explain them. Eventually, I moved into a new apartment, a more modern place with less character, but significantly more peace of mind. I hoped that leaving the old apartment behind would put an end to my troubles, and for the most part, it did. However, every so often, I find myself waking up in the middle of the night, convinced that I hear the same tapping sounds or feel a sudden drop in temperature. I've also developed a habit of checking every nook and cranny of my new apartment before going to bed, just to make sure there's nothing out of place. It might sound paranoid, but I can't help it. The experiences I had in that old apartment left a mark on me. I'm now more cautious about the places I choose to live, and I make sure to investigate any potential red flags before committing. I don't know what it was that I experienced in that apartment. I've tried to rationalize it, to find logical explanations for the strange events, but I haven't been able to come up with anything that fits. I don't know if it was a manifestation of some kind of energy, if it was my mind playing tricks on me, or if it was something else entirely. All I know is that the experience changed me. Thank you for taking the time to read my story, Mr. Phantom Knight. I hope it helps others who might be dealing with similar experiences. Sometimes the scariest things are the ones we can't see or fully understand. And while I may never find out what happened in that old apartment, I've learned to trust my instincts and be cautious about the places I call home. Best regards, Lucas. Dear Mr. Phantom Knight, I never thought I'd find myself writing a letter about something as unsettling as what happened to me. I've always considered myself a pragmatic person. I work as an engineer, and my days are filled with calculations, technical problems, and logical solutions. I prefer to rely on reason and evidence, but what happened to me a few months ago has completely shaken my belief in what can be explained by science. It all started when I bought an old house in Calgary. The house was built in the 1920s and had been vacant for several years. Despite its age and some visible wear and tear, I was drawn to its character. The high ceilings, large windows, and intricate woodwork spoke to me in a way that newer homes simply couldn't. I saw it as a project, a chance to restore something beautiful to its former glory. The first few weeks were spent getting the house into livable condition. I painted walls, replaced fixtures, and cleaned out years of dust and debris. The work was tiring, but it was also satisfying. I felt a strong connection to the house, and I was eager to make it my home. It wasn't until I started sleeping there that things began to feel off. At first, it was just small things. I'd hear faint noises in the middle of the night, creaks and groans from the old wooden floors that I chalked up to the house settling. But then, more peculiar things started happening. One evening, I was in the kitchen preparing dinner when I noticed a strange cold spot near the doorway. It was a warm day, and the rest of the house felt comfortable. But right by the doorway, there was a sudden, intense chill. I thought it might be a draft, so I checked the windows and doors, but everything was sealed tight. I shrugged it off as a quirk of the old house. Things escalated quickly. I started to notice that items in the house would move on their own. I'd put something down in one place, and it would end up somewhere entirely different. It was never anything major, just small objects like pens, books, or cups. I told myself that I was simply forgetting where I had left things, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The real turning point came one night when I was awakened by a loud noise. It sounded like something heavy had fallen, followed by the sound of shuffling footsteps. I jumped out of bed and went to investigate, but found nothing out of place. The noise seemed to come from the basement, so I went down to check. The basement was dark and filled with old furniture and boxes, but there was nothing amiss. I tried to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled over me and went back to bed. From then on, the disturbances became more frequent and intense. I began to experience the sensation of being watched. I'd be sitting in a room, working or reading, and suddenly feel as though someone was standing behind me. I'd turn around, expecting to see someone there, but the room was always empty. One particularly unsettling night, I was lying in bed when I heard a scratching sound coming from the walls. It was a slow, deliberate noise, like nails dragging across wood. The sound was coming from behind the headboard of my bed. I was terrified, but I mustered the courage to move the bed away from the wall and inspect it. There was nothing there, no signs of any damage or activity. I tried to ignore it, but the scratching continued every night. I decided to try and understand what was happening. I researched the history of the house and discovered that it had been built by a wealthy family in the 1920s. The original owner had been a prominent businessman, but he had fallen on hard times, and the house had changed hands several times over the years. I couldn't find any records of anything unusual happening in the house, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeply wrong. Things came to a head one evening when I was working late in the study. The room was quiet, and I was focused on my work when I felt a sudden temperature drop. The room grew icy cold, and I could see my breath in the air. I got up to check the windows and doors, but everything was closed. As I turned back to my desk, I noticed that my papers were scattered across the floor. It looked as if someone had gone through them. I was alone in the house, and I couldn't figure out how it had happened. That night, I had a vivid dream that seemed more like a nightmare. I dreamed that I was being chased through the house by a shadowy figure. The figure had no discernible features, just a dark, shifting shape that seemed to merge with the darkness around it. I woke up in a cold sweat, and the feeling of being chased stayed with me even after I was fully awake. The following day, I decided to take a break from the house and stayed at a hotel. I hoped that getting away from the place would help clear my mind and give me some perspective. When I returned to the house, the disturbances seemed to have intensified. The cold spots were colder, the noises louder, and the sense of being watched more pronounced. I began to consider the possibility that I was not alone in the house. I tried setting up cameras to capture any unusual activity, but the footage never showed anything out of the ordinary. I reviewed the recordings repeatedly, searching for some sign of what was happening, but all I found were empty rooms and mundane scenes. One night, I was lying in bed when I felt a presence sitting on the edge of the bed. The mattress sank under an invisible weight, and I could feel the pressure on my legs. I tried to sit up, but I felt as though I was being held down. I could hear faint whispers in the dark, but they were too indistinct to understand. I struggled against the unseen force, and eventually, the pressure lifted, leaving me breathless and terrified. I reached out to a local paranormal investigation group, hoping they might have some insight. They conducted a thorough investigation of the house, using equipment to measure electromagnetic fields, temperature changes, and other indicators of supernatural activity. Their findings were inconclusive, but they did confirm that there were fluctuations in the electromagnetic fields that couldn't be easily explained. After their visit, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I performed a thorough cleansing of the house, following various methods I found online. I burned sage, sprinkled salt, and recited prayers to cleanse the space. For a while, it seemed to help. The disturbances became less frequent, and I was able to sleep a bit more soundly. However, the sense of unease never fully went away. Even now, I sometimes feel as though something is watching me or lurking just out of sight. I've since moved on to a new home, but the memories of that house linger. I've become more cautious and attentive to any signs of trouble in my new place. Thank you for listening to my story, Mr. Phantom Knight. I hope that sharing my experience can offer some insight or comfort to others who might be dealing with similar unsettling situations. Sometimes the scariest things are the ones we can't explain, and those are the ones that stay with us long after we've moved on. Best regards, Jake. Dear Mr. Phantom Knight, I've always prided myself on being a practical and rational person. My job as a nurse requires me to deal with emergencies and make quick decisions based on facts and evidence. I have always approached life with a sense of realism and skepticism, particularly when it comes to the supernatural. So when I started experiencing unnerving events in my new home, I was determined to find logical explanations. However, as the incidents became more frequent and bizarre, I was forced to confront something beyond my comprehension. I had recently moved into a charming two-story house on the outskirts of Edmonton. The house was perfect, a historic gem with exposed brick walls, a large garden, and a wraparound porch that seemed to promise tranquility. After a stressful year at work, I was excited about the fresh start this house symbolized. The move was smooth, and I quickly fell into a comfortable routine of unpacking and decorating. The first few weeks were relatively uneventful. I enjoyed setting up my new space and was delighted with how quickly the house felt like home. It wasn't until the third week that I began to notice small anomalies that I couldn't easily dismiss. I would find kitchen utensils in different spots than where I left them, and my bookshelves seemed to be rearranging themselves. At first, I chalked it up to my own forgetfulness, or maybe even some minor lapses in memory. However, as these occurrences continued, I started to question whether there was a more sinister explanation. One evening, I was settled in the living room, watching TV and enjoying the quiet of the house, when I heard a distinct sound of footsteps coming from the upstairs hallway. The noise was clear and deliberate, not the random creaks of an old house settling. My heart skipped a beat as I froze, trying to process what I had heard. I quickly went upstairs to check, but there was no one there. I checked each room and even the attic, but everything was exactly as it should be. I tried to convince myself that the sound was just the house settling, or perhaps an issue with the pipes. But the feeling of unease lingered. The real trouble began when I started hearing scratching sounds coming from within the walls of my bedroom. It wasn't just a one-time occurrence. It was a persistent noise that seemed to come from behind the drywall. The scratching was accompanied by occasional thumps, like something heavy being dragged around. I called an exterminator, suspecting that there might be a rodent problem. To my dismay, they found no evidence of any pests. They assured me that the house was free of any infestations, but the scratching continued unabated. At this point, I began to feel a constant, gnawing sense of dread. I tried to dismiss the noises as figments of my imagination, but the sounds were too real and too consistent. I started avoiding the house as much as possible, spending long hours at work or with friends, just to escape the unsettling atmosphere that seemed to hang over the place. Despite my best efforts to ignore the noises, they became a constant source of anxiety. One evening, I stayed late at work, hoping to avoid being alone in the house. My colleague and I were discussing some cases in the break room when I casually mentioned the strange occurrences. She suggested that I might be experiencing stress-related hallucinations, or that my mind was playing tricks on me. I appreciated her concern and considered her theory, but it didn't quite explain the reality I was living. When I returned home that night, the atmosphere in the house felt heavier than usual. The scratching sounds were louder, and I could hear them even with the lights on. I decided to investigate further. I grabbed a flashlight and went through the house, checking every nook and cranny. I even knocked on the walls to see if there was a hollow space behind them. But there was nothing unusual, just the same old house. The whispering began a few nights later. I was trying to fall asleep when I heard a faint, urgent whispering. It was too soft to make out any words, but it was clear that someone, or something, was trying to get my attention. I turned on the bedside lamp and looked around, but the room was empty. The whispering continued every night, growing more insistent and unsettling. It felt as if the voice was just beyond my hearing, but I could never quite catch the words. One night I woke up to a chilling sensation. It felt like a cold hand gripping my ankle. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or call out. The feeling was so real that I could feel the pressure of the grip. I turned on the light, and the room was empty, but the sensation of being touched lingered. I checked under the bed and in the closet, but found nothing out of place. Determined to get to the bottom of things, I decided to investigate the history of the house. I visited the local archives and researched its past. The house had been built in the 1950s and had been occupied by several families over the decades. There were no records of any unusual incidents, but I did find a mention of a previous tenant who had reported some disturbances. The archives didn't provide much detail, but it was clear that the house had a history of unexplained events. The final straw came one night when I was jolted awake by a deafening bang. It was so forceful that it shook the walls and rattled the windows. I jumped out of bed, heart pounding, and rushed downstairs, thinking there had been a break-in. I found nothing out of place, but the noise had left me shaken. I called the police, but they found no evidence of a disturbance or break-in. The house was as quiet as ever. That night, I made the decision to leave. I packed up my belongings and moved in with a friend until I could find a new place to live. My friend was understanding and offered me a place to stay, but I could tell she was concerned about my well-being. I found a new apartment eventually, one in a modern building with none of the charm or character of the old house, but also none of the unsettling experiences. Even now, in my new home, I sometimes find myself listening for odd noises or checking the walls. The experiences in that old house left a mark on me. I can't help but be cautious, and I still have moments of anxiety when I hear unexpected sounds. Thank you for listening to my story, Mr. Phantom Knight. Sharing it is a way for me to process what happened and perhaps find some closure. I hope that by recounting my experience, I can offer some comfort to others who might be facing similar unsettling situations. Sometimes the scariest things are the ones we can't explain or understand, and it's those moments that test our grasp on reality. Best regards, Carol. Dear Mr. Phantom Knight, I never imagined I'd be writing a letter about something as unsettling as what happened to me. I'm Liz, and I live in Vancouver. I'm a freelance graphic designer, and my work often keeps me at home, working late into the night. I've always enjoyed the solitude and quiet of my apartment, but a few months ago, that sense of peace was shattered by a series of inexplicable and frightening events. It all began when I moved into a new apartment. The building was old but well-maintained, and the apartment itself was charming, large windows, high ceilings, and a cozy atmosphere that felt just right. I was thrilled to have my own space and quickly settled into a routine. The first few weeks were uneventful. I enjoyed the peacefulness of my new home and found comfort in the familiar rhythms of my work. But then, I started noticing subtle, strange occurrences. At first they seemed like minor annoyances, a flicker of the lights, a door that seemed to close on its own. I chalked these up to the quirks of an old building, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. One evening, I was working late at my desk when I heard a soft, rhythmic tapping sound coming from the hallway. It was faint, but it was consistent. Tap, 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 as if someone were tapping on the walls. I got up to check, but the hallway was empty, and there was no apparent source of the noise. I dismissed it as a part of the building's old plumbing or something similar. As the weeks went by, the tapping grew louder and more frequent. It wasn't just limited to the hallway. I started hearing it in different parts of the apartment, often when I was alone. It was disconcerting, but I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just the building settling or some sort of mechanical noise. My friends and family thought I was imagining things and reassured me that old buildings can have odd noises. One night, I was sitting on my couch when the tapping suddenly became more intense. It felt like someone was knocking on my front door, but when I went to check, no one was there. The sound continued, moving from the door to the walls and then to the floorboards. I was alone in the apartment, and the noise seemed to be coming from all directions. The next day, I decided to investigate further. I examined the walls and floorboards, looking for any signs of damage or loose panels. I found nothing out of the ordinary. I even checked with the building management to see if there were any ongoing repairs or construction that might explain the noise. But they assured me there were no such activities happening. The disturbances soon escalated. I began experiencing strange occurrences in different parts of the apartment. My keys would go missing, only to reappear in places I was certain I hadn't left them. I'd find objects rearranged on shelves, and sometimes the sound of shuffling footsteps seemed to follow me from room to room. The feeling of being watched became more pronounced, especially when I was alone. One particularly unsettling night, I was preparing dinner when I noticed that the lights in the kitchen flickered. I thought it was a temporary issue with the electrical system, but the flickering became more erratic, and the lights started to dim. I went to the fuse box to check for any problems, but everything seemed normal. As I returned to the kitchen, I noticed that the refrigerator door was slightly ajar, even though I was certain I had closed it. Later that evening, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a loud crash coming from the kitchen. I rushed to see what had happened, but when I arrived, everything seemed intact. The noise had been so sudden and forceful that it had rattled me. I searched the kitchen thoroughly, but found no sign of anything out of place. I even checked the cabinets and appliances, but there was no obvious cause for the noise. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept hearing the tapping sound, and it seemed to be getting closer. It was as if someone or something was moving around just outside my bedroom door. I tried to ignore it and eventually fell asleep, but the sense of unease remained. I started keeping a journal to document these occurrences, hoping that writing them down might help me make sense of what was happening. The journal quickly filled with accounts of strange noises, missing objects, and feelings of being watched. The tapping continued, now accompanied by a new sound, a low, rhythmic humming. It was as if someone was singing softly, but the tune was unfamiliar and haunting. The humming would start out faint and grow louder until it seemed to fill the apartment. I'd search for its source, but I never found anything. One night, while working late in my studio, I felt a sudden cold draft. The room grew icy cold, and I could see my breath in the air. I got up to check the windows and doors, but everything was sealed tight. As I turned back to my desk, I noticed that my papers were scattered across the floor. It looked as if someone had gone through them. I was alone in the apartment, and I couldn't figure out how it had happened. Desperate for answers, I decided to research the history of the building. I visited the local archives and found that the building had been constructed in the 1920s. It had been home to several tenants over the decades, but there were no records of any unusual incidents. I spoke with some longtime residents, but they hadn't experienced anything out of the ordinary. It seemed that the disturbances were isolated to my apartment. Feeling increasingly unsettled, I decided to reach out to a local paranormal investigation group. They conducted a thorough investigation of the apartment using equipment to measure electromagnetic fields, temperature changes, and other indicators of supernatural activity. Their findings were inconclusive, but they did confirm that there were fluctuations in the electromagnetic fields that couldn't be easily explained. They suggested that these anomalies might be contributing to my experiences, but they couldn't pinpoint a specific cause. After their visit, I tried various methods to cope with the disturbances. I performed a cleansing of the apartment, using sage and other rituals to clear the space. I rearranged furniture, changed my routine, and even used white noise machines to mask the tapping sound. For a short time, it seemed to help. The disturbances became less frequent, and I was able to sleep a bit more soundly. However, the sense of unease never fully went away. Even when the noises subsided, I still felt like something was lurking just out of sight. The tapping and humming would return sporadically, and the feeling of being watched persisted. I began to feel like a stranger in my own home, constantly on edge and unable to relax. One evening, I decided to take a break from the apartment and stayed at a friend's house. I hoped that getting away from the place would help clear my mind and give me some perspective. When I returned to the apartment, I found that the disturbances had intensified. The tapping was louder and the humming was more persistent. I felt a renewed sense of dread and unease. The final straw came one night when I was lying in bed, trying to sleep. I felt a presence sitting on the edge of the bed. The mattress sank under an invisible weight, and I could feel the pressure on my legs. I tried to sit up, but I felt as though I was being held down. I could hear faint whispers in the dark, but they were too indistinct to understand. I struggled against the unseen force, and eventually, the pressure lifted, leaving me breathless and terrified. I made the difficult decision to move out of the apartment. I found a new place to live, and while it was a relief to leave the old apartment behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had left something unresolved. I still think about the old apartment and wonder what might have caused those disturbances. The memories of the tapping and the sense of unease linger, and I find myself constantly checking the walls and listening for any signs of trouble in my new home. Thank you for listening to my story, Mr. Phantom Knight. I hope that sharing my experience can offer some comfort to others who might be facing similar unsettling situations. Sometimes, the scariest things are the ones that seem to have no explanation, and those are the ones that stay with us long after we've left them behind. Best regards, Liz. And that, my friends, concludes the 5 bone-chilling stories shared by our brave subscribers. From the eerie echoes in William's abandoned building to the unsettling presence in Liz's apartment. Each story reminds us that the unknown is always lurking just out of sight, waiting to be discovered. I want to thank William, Lucas, Carol, Jake, and Liz for sharing their experiences with us. Remember, if you have a story that you want to share, feel free to send it in, because here, we never shy away from the unexplained. As always, stay curious, stay cautious, and most importantly, stay safe. You never know what might be watching from the shadows. Until next time, keep the lights on and the stories coming. See you in the next video.